Hey there, today I'm going to be benchmarking the Intel i5-2400 in 21 games on Steam and Epic Games. I am pairing this i5-2400 with 24GB of DDR3 RAM at 1600MHz, as well as an SSD for the game drive and the boot drive, and I am pairing it with a GTX 980 Ti from Nvidia with the latest Nvidia drivers. Starting off is Apex Legends at 1080p on the low settings. Apex Legends was running pretty good. It was getting around 65 frames per second on average with a 1% low of around 16, so not the best in the world, but not the worst in the world. It is definitely playable. The 1% lows could be quite a bit higher. It was somewhat disappointing how low the 1% lows were, because at times, for several seconds in a row, the game actually was getting less than 30 FPS in several situations. Usually looking at buildings and entering buildings, that happened, but yeah, overall, it was a nice experience. The next game is BattleBit Remastered, and BattleBit Remastered was running very, very good. It was getting 156 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows were 99. So pretty much a 100 frame per second or above experience the entire time. Sure, this is only a 32 player versus 32 player match. If I did 64 versus 64 or 127 versus 127, it would be exponentially more intensive. Oh, by the way, this is at the ultra settings. Although, it doesn't look like the ultra settings, but it really is the ultra settings. Just BattleBit Remastered doesn't really have the best looking settings or visuals in the whole wide world, but the trade-off is amazing frame rate. BeamNG Drive runs very, very nice, so I would consider these the high settings. They aren't quite the ultra settings, but they certainly are quite high. They're custom settings, of course. I didn't just select a preset to get these settings. I turned the mesh quality down because that is quite CPU intensive, but it doesn't really help the visuals all that much. It's just how far away things are rendered, basically. Let's say a tree or a guardrail. You have to get somewhat close for it to be rendered versus seeing it all the way across the map. It's not the biggest thing in the world, but it does definitely help the frame rate a lot in a CPU bound situation. Either way, the game was getting about 60 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows, oh wow, they were actually really good. They were around 43 to 40. So overall, BeamNG Drive is extremely playable and a very nice experience. BioShock Infinite, of course, is a very old game, and because of that, it runs amazing. And also, it looks, at least to me, amazing. Sure, if you look very close at the textures, it could use a bit of improvement, but the thing is, it looks amazing. That's the main thing. It doesn't look like Call of Duty or something, where everything's a blurry mess and it runs bad. No, this game, everything looks nice, and it actually runs nice as well, or beyond nice. I did a loop around the map, well, not the whole map. I'm sure there's a lot more to the map than this, but what I usually benchmark around where this little area is here. I don't know the name of it, but it's basically the first place you spawn into when you open up the game, besides going through the original story mode thing where they put you underwater and stuff like that. Either way, I'm bad at explaining this, sorry. Either way, the frame rate is 158 on average, and the 1% lows are 66, so extremely playable. Naraka Bladepoint! I don't know why I like saying that. Or Naraka, I don't know the name of it. Naraka Bladepoint. I was playing at 1080p on the low settings in a bot match, and the game wasn't running that good. So, sure, it was getting 83 frames per second on average, but the 1% lows were 1. That is not good. That is really, really bad. So, I tried setting the game to the lowest settings instead. I didn't restart. It didn't ask me to restart, so I didn't. And at the lowest settings, it still sucked. The 1% lows didn't really improve. And overall, Naraka Bladepoint, I mean, it's free, go ahead and give it a try, but it's not going to run all that good on this CPU, at least in a bot match, which is what I was in. Borderlands 3 runs pretty similar, actually, to Naraka Bladepoint in a way, so the average frame rate is 76, and the 1% low is 13. Yeah, Bladepoint and Borderlands, for some reason, both suffer from lots of stuttering, and I am not exactly sure why. pretty much every CPU I throw at Borderlands 3 ends up having a really low 1% low, like this for example, 13. This is not familiar with Call of Duty, but whatever I'm playing right now, I was playing at the minimum settings with FSR set to quality, and the game was running not very good at all. It was getting 38 frames per second on average, and the 1% low was 18. Although it is a playable frame rate, it's just not really that good. There's a couple of reasons for it. Number one, it's a pretty unstable frame rate, and reason number two, it's a FPS shooter game. You don't really want 18 frames per second or 38 frames per second in a game like this. Is it doable? Yes, because I just constantly died this entire round. So the average frame rate was 100, the 1% lows were 50. Except the 50 was including when I die, which gives a lag spike. If I didn't die, the 1% low would most certainly be a lot higher than 50, but I died like 30 or 40 times in this round, meaning a lot of the time it was in the splash screen saying, hey, Alex has told you or something, and yeah, overall, it's a very playable experience, but maybe not for the most competitive player on Earth. Cyberpunk 2077 didn't run that good at all, and I was running on the low settings with FSR set to quality. Either way, the average frame rate throughout my little benchmark run in the map is 33, so not the worst, but that's borderline unplayable. And oftentimes, the frame rate would actually drop below 30 and it would be hovering in the mid-20s in more intensive areas in the city. So, is it playable? I don't know. Maybe you're okay with that, maybe you're not, but it's definitely no award-winning performance. Destiny 2 is quite confusing to me. I can't get the overlay for the frame rate to work, so we have to deal with a very small frame rate number on the top right of the screen, which I can barely read for one, and for two, I barely even know how to get into the map. I don't even know if this is the main map. I don't know. It's a confusing game. It was running fine. There was a few little stutters I could feel, but I don't have a frame time graph to tell me what frame rate or what stutters I'm experiencing, but either way, yeah, the game ran fine. It seems playable. A little bit of stutters here and there, but very fine. The 1% lows were sitting around 35, and the average frame rate was around 60. At times, when the action heated up on screen, the average frame rate dropped to around 55 to 51 at the worst, roughly. So overall, a very playable experience. By the way, this is a live view of Dota. I'm not actually playing it, I am instead watching a match, because I don't know how to play Dota, so we're just going to watch a game instead. Dying Light 1 ran, at least to me, amazing. I was playing the medium settings, and I am in that little safety fenced off area in the city. I'm new to the game, and I just like that area because it's safer. Either way, the average frame rate was 98, running around that little area, and the 1% low was 59. So overall, that is a very, very nice experience. Now I just need to figure out how to fix my pipe, which looks very fine to me, so it's a more effective weapon, because apparently a working pipe is not good enough. It needs to be a special one. Fall Guys at 1080p on the high preset was running very nice. It was getting 160 frames per second on average, and the 1% low was 80. So it's 60 plus FPS experience. Well, even almost a 100 frame per second plus experience. This isn't the normal run in a straight line kind of Fall Guys. This is some other map. I don't know what it is exactly, but one way or another, it's Fall Guys. It's going to be extremely playable on pretty much any map you try to play. It's just that kind of game. It will run perfect and look nice, no matter what. Grand Theft Auto 5 slash GTA 5, I was playing at the normal settings, which is also the minimum settings, which is also the low settings. There's 3 different ways of describing it. Either way, the game is running phenomenally. It's running good. I can't speak English apparently. It was getting 83 frames per second on average, and the 1% lows are 38. I ended up playing for about an hour. I got distracted, and yeah, that's what happens when I get distracted. I play the game for too long. Either way, with lots of cars on screen, I was still getting 80 plus frames per second. It's just a very nice experience. GTA 5 is completely playable with the i5-2400. Halo Infinite actually surprised me, so not just the CPU is maxed out at the low settings, but the GPU is as well. The GTX is pretty slow quad-core CPU on low settings. I don't know throttling, but either way, yeah, the i5 ran the game perfectly fine, 77 frames per second on average with 1% low of 40. I'm sure if you had like a RTX 4090 hooked up to this, you would probably get a little bit more frame rate, but overall, it's extremely playable. Palworld at 1080p on the low settings, not the very low, just low, was running pretty good. It was getting 67 frames per second on average, although again, it stutters a decent amount. The 1% lows are 18. So it's a very playable experience, it just could be better. For some reason, Palworld enjoys stuttering just like Bladepoint and Borderlands 3. I almost said Borderlands 3. No, wait, that was actually the right word. Never mind. Yeah, no, what I'm trying to say though is Palworld runs very nice, just it stutters. Portal at 1080p on the highest / ultra settings was getting 254 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 135. Some maps are harder to run than others. I'm sure some of the maps you'll end up getting more like 150 frames per second instead, but 250 is in this map, which has a moving platform in it, which might be somewhat intensive. Not the most intensive, some of them have particle effects and things like that, but overall, Portal is a very extremely easy game to run, and it's extremely playable and a very extremely good experience. PUBG ran really badly, so I was playing at the very low settings and I was playing on the large map. There's no preset for the large map. I was playing on a game mode that has a large map. Or something. I don't know what the names of PUBG are. Either way, the game was running very poorly. It was getting 43 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 0. Although the 0 it was getting was more like -3 frames per second or something. Like 3 seconds per frame. Not very good at all. It was a very stuttery experience, and especially when you start driving around in a vehicle, it gets even worse. But if you're just walking around, I guess it's doable, but it's an FPS game. This is not a very acceptable experience / result. So, you're actually 54, but if I didn't constantly die, I'm pretty sure it would be right around 60. So, overall, Team Fortress 2 seems to be a very playable game, and you probably could set it to Ultra and get very similar frame rate if you have a powerful graphics card like this. The Finals was running about like PUBG was, sadly. It was getting 42 frames per second on average with a 1% low of 16. And I have a rather interesting thing I discovered throughout the gameplay to tell you. Things don't load in. Sort of. Like pictures, for example, or just nice high-textured areas take a long time to load in, and then once they load in, well, the frame rate doesn't drop, it looks nicer. And it's quite weird. It reminds me of GTA 5 on the single-core Celeron I tested in a previous video. Not very good, but it definitely is playable, I guess. But again, it's an FPS game. It's not that great. Valorant at 1080p on the minimum / low settings was getting a very nice 161 frames per second on average. That is amazing. And the 1% lows were 51. 2400S. So, can I recommend getting the i5 2400 in 2024? Not really. The reason why is the i5 only has 4 cores and 4 threads. If you go and get yourself another CPU like an i7 or a Xeon, they have 8 threads. It's not twice the performance, but it's definitely a nice increase in the performance category. If your motherboard supports Xeons, I recommend looking into the Xeons, because they are actually cheaper than the i7. It's a server CPU instead of a consumer CPU, but if your motherboard supports it, go with the Xeon. Also, the difference between Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge is newer and it's more efficient and it's slightly faster. So if a Ivy Bridge Xeon is not much more than the Sandy Bridge Xeon, go with the Ivy Bridge Xeon. And the i7 3770 is $25.95. So you save about $10. It takes you straight to this part right here where it shows you all of the 4-core. This is also the end of the video, so if you could leave a like, that would be amazing. If you could subscribe, that would also be amazing. I'm trying to turn this into a hobby that pays of some sort, so if you could do that, yeah, again, that would be amazing. Either way, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.